This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 13 of Here's How. In this podcast, I'll be talking about Garda corruption and what can be done about it, about milk quotas, farming subsidies and what they mean to urban dwellers, and there'll be two exciting announcements about developments on the show.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Claire Byrne hosted Claire Byrne Live on the 7th of September. I could bring up a lot of issues with RTE naming programmes after their stars and relying on their personalities rather than on a team of researchers and producers, but that's a different story. Immigration, refugees, asylum seekers and race are a mix that produce strong opinions and often more heat than light. One of the features of this topic is that people can come up with facts and figures that they will hold on to despite a complete lack of evidence. You'll still meet people who will tell you with absolute certainty that Nigerians get free cars from the Department of Social Welfare. They can't remember who, but they're sure some fella off the telly said it only a while back. Those urban legends are even harder to contradict when some fella off the telly did say it. For that reason, people on TV and radio current affairs shows, especially live ones, have a particular duty to police what is said, and when myths like this are said, to slap them down, ask the speaker for a source for what they're saying, and expose the truth. On the Claire Byrne live show, one member of the audience was introduced like this.
Okay, James Reynolds. James, would you have a problem with that? You're from Longford Direct Provision there too.
There was no mention of the fact that the same James Reynolds was an activist for Declan Ganley's right-wing anti-European party Libertas, or that James Reynolds led a breakaway group from the IFA called Farmers for No that was focused on keeping Turkey out of the EU. Unlike when other audience members spoke, there was no caption on screen either. This is what he said.
And we are made to feel that we're responsible for that child's death, when in fact the real cause for the child's death was the fact that I've seen this report on Sky News I heard it myself, where the father actually brought his wife and two children on a raft destined for Europe. Why? Because he wanted to have his teeth fixed.
At that point, Claire Byrne did interject and challenge him, but not on the claim that he made, which is a garbled version of an interview given by a relative of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old boy who drowned fleeing the Syrian civil war. In fairness to RTE, a source has told me that they did not have full knowledge of who James Reynolds was, but RTE did know who councillor Seamus Treanor is. He's a councillor from Monaghan, and he was introduced as such. Here's one thing that he said.
Now, Prunches de Rossa were sitting there that night. He said 5,000 people will come in from Eastern Europe. And everyone knows today that we are now hitting about 900,000.
But Seamus, I want to talk to you about Monaghan Town. I want you to tell.
He claimed that there are 900,000 people from Eastern Europe in Ireland, and he continued talking uninterrupted. At no point was he challenged on this, and this false information is never corrected anywhere in the programme. The true figure, according to the 2011 census, is about a quarter of that. He went on to say,
you see, it's been proven that 90% of the people, by a government report one time, it said 90% of the people in direct provision is bogus.
That one's a bit difficult if you only have the audio, but he repeated it a few times in the programme that a government report has proven that 90% of asylum seekers in direct provision are bogus. Again, this is nonsense. Again, it was unchallenged at the time. Again, it was never corrected. Nora Casey, the former Dragon's Den presenter, was not in the audience. She was on the panel, and here's her in one exchange.
Bear in mind one thing about when we had the previous whether it's influx, whatever you want to call it. One of the biggest problems we had was unaccompanied minors who came into this country.
And we lost 400 of them.
No, we didn't lose 400.
We did lose 400.
Yeah,
there is a report
they didn't disappear.
They completely disappeared into child trafficking. We brought in 500.
No.
The meaning of those words are pretty clear, that 400 children, after they arrived in Ireland, were lost in some way to people traffickers. More nonsense. I can't find anything remotely close to this. There are reports of some children who were trafficked into Ireland, but the numbers are in the low tens, and that certainly doesn't refer to children who arrive in Ireland and then become the victims of people traffickers, as Nora Casey says. This is important stuff. Half-heard stories and statistics get repeated in the pubs and the clubs and become part of our national narrative, particularly when they suit the agenda of an interest group. The media, particularly the mainstream media, trades on trust and believability. If they give that trust to gombeans who peddle fairy tales to appeal to the lowest common denominator, they won't have it for long.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
And before any of the interviews, the first of my announcements. The Here's How podcast has been shortlisted for the 2015 Blog Awards Ireland. It's in the innovation category. The awards will be made at a ceremony on the 22nd of October at the Tivoli Theatre in Dublin. 30% of the votes in choosing the winners comes from a public vote. You can vote online, so I'd be really pleased if you could go to your computer and vote for this show. You can find a link on the webpage of this podcast, www.here'show.ie. You can click on that link. It brings you straight to the voting page, so vote early, vote often, but do get your votes in before Monday, the 21st of September. Claire Daly is the independent TD for North Dublin. She's made a name for herself inquiring into Gardaí and possible Garda corruption. Claire, when the Fennelly report came out, a lot of the focus is on whether or not the Taoiseach constructively dismissed the Garda Commissioner Callanan. If he didn't, shouldn't he have?
Absolutely. That is a point that we made. I mean, it is, I think the media have maybe seized on the wrong end of the stick on this one. The reality is what were the circumstances that led up to the Commissioner being pushed or deciding to jump? It was systemic problems in Garda Síochána, problems with GSOC, the Ombudsman's Office, the appalling treatment of whistleblowers, the penalty points debacle, and a mounting pressure in that regard. In actual fact, we called for the Commissioner and the Minister's resignation long before those decisions were actually made. And I think the really important thing about what's happening now is that we have a new Commissioner and a new Minister, but all of those systemic problems are still in place. And that's the real debate, I think, that we should be having. And that's the thing that the government will not be able to dodge. I think legally the Taoiseach had no power to sack Commissioner Callanan, but he did ensure that he was pushed.
If you were in the same position just on that one specific decision, that was really the right thing to do. He sent out his point man and he said, listen, I can't sack you, but I can tell you, if you don't jump, you're going to be pushed.
No, it was the absolute wrong way to do it. I mean, the Taoiseach himself was at pains to say that he had defended the Commissioner at every level through debacle after debacle, where citizens and decent members of Garda Síochána were being utterly shafted internally inside that organisation when they tried to highlight the problems of it. He stood by the Commissioner and the Minister at every turn, and it was the, I suppose, toxic connection between the Minister and the Commissioner that was ultimately their downfall. So I think the whole way in which that political relationship between the Minister and the Commissioner is there. Fine Gael and Labour have ensured that relationship is going to continue. So while they talk about Garda reform, they've actually structured a system that will ensure that toxic relationship will continue into the future. So absolutely, Callanan should have gone. Indeed, Noreen O'Sullivan, who's presently residing over many of the same problems, including an appalling treatment of existing whistleblowers, should go as well. I think a lot of the old hierarchy that's there needs to be cleared out, and we need to engage in a dialogue to constitute a modern police service.
Well, switching the focus to that, and that's something that I think is actually much more important than the ins and outs of one person losing their job. Some years ago, the Metropolitan Police Force in London recognised that they had some good police officers, they had some bad police officers, but they recognised that their force was institutionally racist and that they had to have a force-wide policy to tackle that and to change that. Do you think it's fair to say that despite as the fact that, as you say, there are some good people in the Garda Síochána, isn't it true that the Garda Síochána is institutionally corrupt?
I totally agree with that statement, and I think they need massive institutional change. I think it goes more than educational. We've been a long time calling for the need for the Gardaí to be human rights compliant and to elevate those aspects of their handling. But I think it's probably a little bit like what happened in Northern Ireland when the RUC evolved into the PSNI. There had to be a clearing out of the old guard. Now, I'm not saying the PSNI is perfect, but by making the older officers an offer they couldn't refuse, they did manage to clear out a lot of what was there and bring in some new blood. That's utterly essential. I mean, you know, all of the controversy that surrounded Martin Callanan, a lot of it was to do with his treatment of the whistleblowers, his calling of them disgusting at the Oireachtas Committee, but it was Noreen O'Sullivan, the present commissioner, who was at his side. It was that whole coterie of assistant commissioners who are there now were all part of the hierarchy before, and they're all still in place, and the practices that the Martin Callanan was under pressure for are all still in place as well. And I think there does need to be some institutional overhaul and a clearing out of that old hierarchy if we're to get the type of modern police service who are capable of ruling with the consent of the people or serving the public.
Claire, if you were made Justice Minister in the morning, what would you do on your first day?
Well, the first thing I do would scrap the appalling piece of legislation that the present minister has produced in terms of their excuse for an independent Garda authority. This is something that we've very much pushed and which has been accepted in the public domain, but instead of a really comprehensive bill that would give true transparency and accountability to citizens over on Garda Síochána, a bill which Deputy Mick Wallace actually published 2 years ago was really comprehensive in that regard and would have been international best practice. Instead, the government have come down with a really watered down version of that. If the Gardaí are to represent the public, then we need a new independent Garda authority with real meat and independence to hold them to account. We have already produced legislation on that. If I was Minister for Justice tomorrow, I'd be tabling that included with a nice redundancy package as well for the hierarchy.
And any other specific internal reforms within the Gardaí?
No, look, I mean, it needs to be rebuilt from bottom up. I think there's some really good experts in policing. Professor Dermot Walsh, Vicky Conway, people like that have engaged in huge dialogue and given very good ideas for how a modern police service could be built. We've good examples of that internationally. We don't need to reinvent the wheel in that, but we do need to clear out some of the old personnel. And we need to seriously start listening to those inside the Gardaí who are making complaints. There are a number of whistleblowers at present who are being ostracised and harassed, while those that they have made complaints against have got promoted. Their issues need to be listened to, and guards who are guilty of wrongdoing need to be dealt with.
Claire Daly, Independent TD for Dublin North, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks very much, William.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
The Irish Creamery Milk Suppliers Association, the ICMSA, represents 16,500 Irish farmers, and the Deputy President is Pat McCormack. He's on the line now. Pat, I remember a long time ago hearing about the milk lake that was in Europe. And as far as I remember, that problem was solved, that oversupply of milk was solved when milk quotas were brought in and farmers were legally only allowed to produce a certain amount of milk. And that, of course, kept the prices up and the supply down. That system is being abolished now. Am I right in that?
You are indeed. I suppose the quota euro is gone, introduced in the early 80s and phased out on the 31st of March 2015. I suppose the one thing we have to remember is, while European farmers got the opportunity to produce as much milk as they liked, or as was viably possible for them, the trade-off was a significant reduction over a period of time in the price support mechanisms that were there. We've moved from having price supports in around the equivalent of 28 cents a litre back to having a price support now of a mere 20 and a half cents a litre.
Right. So for somebody maybe who doesn't know so much about farming, can you understand that if I work as a butcher or a baker or a candlestick maker, or if somebody's making, lawnmower widgets, if there's too many people making them, the price goes down, some people go out of business, and then the market returns to equilibrium and the price goes back to something above the cost of production. Why should the EU intervene to push up the price of milk higher than it would be in a free market situation?
Well, I suppose what we're asking for the EU to do is to increase its safety net, and a safety net by virtue of its name is to prevent losses. And, whether it's on a lifeboat, the safety net is there to prevent the loss of life. But in this scenario, in the dairy sector, the safety net is there to prevent the overdue loss of dairy farmers right across Europe. And I suppose, the European Union was founded to provide food security for the European taxpayer. And, we feel to be very shortchanged, and the benefits for the European taxpayer will be very short-lived indeed. If European dairy farmers were to go out of business in any significant number, it is necessary to keep dairy production within the European Union for the European citizens.
Mm-hmm. But, for example, not too far away from you, there was a very large Dell factory that employed thousands of people. That was essentially closed down. All of their jobs were moved to Poland. Nobody stepped in and said we should have price support for Irish computers.
I suppose you do make a reasonably valid point, but the one difference is we're talking about food security here, and there is nothing greater or no bigger threat than the food security. It was the B word, the buzzword in 2012 when there was, in early 13, when there was the possibility of a dairy shortage, and ultimately the price increase that came, and the high level of volatility that's there, and what we are calling for is that level of volatility will be taken to a certain degree out of the marketplace in order to sustain, and in particular in the Irish scenario, family farm structure. It is our heritage, it is where we come from, and it is unique to in particular to this island.
So do farmers have more of a right to expect support from the taxpayer than anybody in any other profession?
Well, I suppose what's the greatest concern for a European taxpayer come Monday morning? Is it the security of having food to eat, or the analogy that you drew earlier in the day, or earlier in the interview, as regards the computer? Certainly, we would need food for our very well-being. It is a unique product that farmers right across all sectors produce. It is needed at a minimum by the human being 3 times a day.
In one sense, I agree with you, because if we were to apply market forces to food the same way that we do to, say, for example, computers, if the supply of computers dried up, then the price would go up and people would be drawn into producing more computers because it would be more profitable. Although we might have to suffer a short time with a lack of computers. Lack of computers for a while might be tough. Lack of food would be a different issue entirely. So I do agree with you on that.
It would be life-threatening, Willem.
Excuse me?
It would be life-threatening.
It would, of course. But do you think that perhaps the agricultural lobby has exploited that? There's no industry that has gotten more money from the EU than agriculture. Probably, I think something like half of the entire EU budget has at times been spent on agriculture support. Is that justified?
Well, I suppose that agricultural support hasn't gone directly in recent times as a price support mechanism for food security. It has gone as an environmental protection, where we have the protecting of the environment, and we all hear about the ozone layer and carbon emissions and agriculture needing to reduce those.
Yeah, and dairy cattle are a huge contributor to greenhouse gases.
They are, but from our perspective here in Ireland, we feel with the Origin Green initiative taken by Borbia that we are producing, I suppose, the most efficient and the most sustainable dairy produce possibly globally.
Well, let me then just examine, how do you think this can go forward in the future? Do you think that there will have to be permanent spending by the EU taxpayer in order to keep farmers in business?
No, I think the European Union needs to review the dairy sector across Europe. But, for 2015, the sirens of the fire brigade need to ring, because we are dialing 999 where milk prices are. And
just for an urban audience, what's happened is that milk prices have gone way down this year. That's correct, yeah?
Milk prices in Ireland have collapsed from 39 cents a litre to approximately 25 cents a litre.
Isn't that a market signal that there's too much milk being produced?
Farmers' incomes have disappeared, and I suppose what it is it's market sentiment and buyers, playing on that and buying by the hour rather than the traditional yearly or half yearly or indeed quarterly.
Sure, but if milk prices have gone way down, isn't that a signal that there's too much milk being produced?
Well, globally milk supply is only up by a minute fraction of a percentage, in 2015. Obviously, I suppose there have been issues. We take the Russian ban. That wasn't anything to do with agriculture, but it has had a massive impact on agriculture, and in particular on Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. And ultimately, I suppose their product has created issues for the rest of European farmers.
So what's happening here is that Baltic dairy products can't go into Russia as they might usually be sold, so they're being sold west rather than east.
Well, I suppose there was issues between the European Union and Russia if we go back to the start of it, and Russia decided to ban European dairy produce, and obviously, as you said, the Baltic states were the greatest affected by that. But ultimately, it has spilled over into the rest of Europe, and it wasn't an agricultural issue that created the issue between Europe and Russia, but certainly it is agriculture is paying the price for it.
This is true. Farmers receive a huge amount of subsidy from the EU, whether it's tied to environmental behaviour or not. Do you think that's really fair? Do you think that somebody, say, who's unemployed in an urban area and deprived urban area of Dublin would think that that's fair?
Well, I suppose farmers are the custodians of the countryside, and for that unfortunate individual that would be in a urban area, it is unfortunate for them, but certainly there are a lot of farms out there that are less than break even, and they are obliged to meet certain criteria for food production, which would include significant environmental issues. And as I said, the CAP reform brought in an element of greening, which is going to further enhance the environment and try and protect all our futures and the futures of the generations to come.
Pat McCormack, the Deputy President of the ICMSA, thank you for talking to me.
Thank you.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
And that's almost the end of episode 13 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 8th of September 2015. References for everything I mention in the show are listed in this episode's page on the here'show.ie website. And the second of my announcements is that starting from the next podcast, I'm going to adopt a slightly different format. The shows are going to be shorter and hopefully more frequent, so you will be served the podcast in bite-sized chunks. If you can think of a topic or want to suggest someone to include, and that could be you, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, Please follow @Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and of course subscribe to the show. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. And you can do all of that or get in touch with the show right from www.here'show.ie. Or you could just go out and meet real people and tell them how great the podcast is, and in particular, tell them to go on the website and click on the link to vote for the podcast in the 2015 Blog Awards Ireland. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.